Imagine walking through a desert graveyard where giants go to die. Not people, not animals, but machines that once touched the clouds. Aircraft that carried dreams across continents now sit abandoned, slowly surrendering to dust and time. But among these forgotten titans, one plane stands apart. One aircraft that doesn't just represent luxury or engineering. It represents a legend, a mystery sealed for nearly half a century. And when it was finally opened, what investigators found inside didn't just shock them. It changed everything we thought we knew about the final days of the king of rock and roll. This is the story of Elvis Presley's private jet, a 1962 Lockheed Jetstar that vanished into obscurity for 48 years, and the terrifying secrets it held within its metal walls. Before we dive deep into the chilling discoveries inside this aircraft, you need to understand something crucial about Elvis Presley. Most people know him as the hip-swiveling, heart-throbbing icon who revolutionized music and culture. But there was another side to Elvis, a side that few ever witnessed. Behind the sequin jumpsuits and sold-out concerts was a man obsessed with escape. Not just metaphorically, but literally. Elvis didn't just want to fly. He needed to fly. His relationship with aviation went far beyond mere transportation. It was about control, freedom, and perhaps most importantly, isolation from a world that had consumed him whole. In the mid-1970s, at the peak of his later career, Elvis owned not one, not two, but 3 private jets. This wasn't typical even for superstars of his caliber. The first was the legendary Lisa Marie, a massive Convair 880 that he purchased in April 1975 for $250,000. But that was just the beginning. He then spent over $800,000, an astronomical sum at the time, completely customizing every inch of that aircraft. We're talking about gold-plated seatbelts, suede chairs, leather-covered tables, and 24-karat gold-flecked sinks. The bedroom alone was more luxurious than most people's entire homes. But even that wasn't enough for the king. His second jet was another Lockheed Jetstar, which he affectionately named the Hound Dog too. This one featured a striking yellow and green interior, personally designed by Elvis himself. It was primarily used to transport his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, and staff members from city to city during his grueling concert tours. And then there was the third jet, the one we're talking about today, the one that would become lost to history for decades, the one that held secrets nobody was prepared to discover. On December 22, 1976, less than 8 months before his death, Elvis purchased this 1962 Lockheed 1329 Jetstar from Omni Aircraft Sales for $840,000. Think about that timing for a moment. 8 months before he died, Elvis was still investing nearly $1 million in another private jet. What does that tell us? Was he planning something? Was he trying to escape? Or was this purchase itself a symptom of the deeper problems that would ultimately claim his life? The bill of sale still exists today, bearing Elvis's signature alongside his father Vernon's. This detail is crucial because it reveals something deeply personal. Elvis bought this jet with his father, someone he trusted implicitly, someone who represented family and stability in a life that was rapidly spiraling out of control. This wasn't just a business transaction. It was a father-son investment in what they believed would be their future together. Neither of them could have known that within months, Elvis would be gone, and this aircraft would begin its long journey into abandonment and obscurity. Here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Elvis died on August 16, 1977, just 8 months after purchasing this jet. And here's the terrifying part that nobody talks about. According to records, Elvis never actually flew on this particular Jetstar. Not once. Let that sink in for a moment. He spent $840,000, the equivalent of over $4 million today, on a private jet that he never used. Why? What was the purpose of this purchase? Was he planning something he never got to execute? Was the jet intended for a specific mission that died with him? These questions haunted investigators when they finally opened those sealed doors decades later. After Elvis's death, the jet was quickly sold off by the estate. Vernon Presley, devastated by the loss of his son and overwhelmed by the complexity of Elvis's financial affairs, had to make difficult decisions. The Jetstar passed through several hands over the following years. One owner was reportedly a Polish collector who had dreams of restoring the aircraft to its former glory. But those dreams never materialized. Instead, the jet ended up in perhaps the most unlikely location imaginable: Roswell, New Mexico. Yes, that Roswell. The same town famous for alleged alien encounters and government conspiracies. And there, in a sprawling aircraft graveyard where commercial airliners go to die, Elvis's private jet sat untouched for 35 to 48 years, depending on which timeline you follow. An aircraft graveyard is an eerie place. Imagine rows upon rows of enormous planes, stripped of their dignity, slowly being cannibalized for parts or simply left to decay under the relentless desert sun. These are machines that once represented the pinnacle of human engineering, that carried thousands of passengers safely through the skies, now reduced to hollow shells baking on a dusty tarmac. The temperature in the New Mexico desert regularly exceeds 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The sun beats down relentlessly, day after day, year after year. Metal expands and contracts. Paint cracks and peels. Rubber seals degrade. Everything that makes an aircraft functional slowly surrenders to entropy. But Elvis's Jetstar was different. While other aircraft in the graveyard were systematically torn apart for salvageable components, Elvis's jet remained completely intact. Nobody touched it. Nobody stripped it. Nobody even entered it for decades.
Why?
Some say it was out of respect for the king. Others suggest that legal complications surrounding its ownership kept it in limbo. The most intriguing theory, however, is that there were explicit instructions that this aircraft was not to be disturbed. Instructions that came from where or whom? Nobody would say. Instructions that held for nearly half a century. The exterior of the jet deteriorated exactly as you'd expect. The once pristine white paint became weathered and yellowed. The metal skin showed signs of oxidation. Dust accumulated in every crevice. The landing gear, locked in position for decades, began to show signs of stress. The windows, once crystal clear, became hazed with UV damage and dust. From the outside, it looked like any other abandoned aircraft. Tragic, certainly, but unremarkable. Just another casualty of time and economics. But appearances, as we're about to discover, can be devastatingly deceiving. Several times over the years, attempts were made to auction off the jet. In 2008, Cruise International estimated its value at between $700,000 and $2 million. The auction failed to meet reserve. In 2018, GWS Auctions tried again, this time estimating the value at between $2 and $3.5 million. Again, the jet failed to sell.
Why?
Because buyers wanted to know what was inside. They wanted documentation of the interior condition. They wanted to understand what they were actually purchasing. But the jet remained sealed. Access was denied. The mystery only deepened. Then came January 8, 2023, Elvis's birthday. At the Mecum auction in Kissimmee, Florida, something unexpected happened. The auction house brought out Priscilla Presley herself to promote the sale of the jet. She stood before potential bidders and gave an emotional speech about honoring Elvis's memory and preserving his legacy. Then, in a bizarre twist that perfectly encapsulates the strange commercialization of Elvis's legacy, she proceeded to hawk her own brand of skin serum to the audience. This surreal moment somehow seemed appropriate for an event centered around selling a deceased icon's abandoned aircraft. The bidding started at $50,000. It immediately jumped to $150,000. The auctioneer worked the room, coaxing higher and higher bids. $200,000. $230,000. Finally, $240,000. Then a telephone bidder came in at $260,000, and the gavel fell. Sold. But then something unexpected happened. The telephone bidder backed out. The deal collapsed. The jet was once again in limbo. That's when James Webb entered the picture. Webb is a YouTube personality who runs a channel called Jimmy's World. His content typically revolves around finding abandoned aircraft, buying them, restoring them, and, if possible, flying them again. He's not a wealthy aviation mogul. He's not a museum curator. He's an entrepreneur with a roofing background who stumbled into aviation YouTube and found unexpected success. Webb had originally planned to bid up to $100,000 on Elvis's jet, but when the opportunity arose to purchase it after the telephone bidder backed out, he negotiated directly with Dana Meekum, the auction house's founder. The result was a deal where Webb would pay $234,000, with the auction house financing most of it, allowing him to put down just $100,000. Webb now owned Elvis Presley's abandoned jet, but he faced an immediate problem. The aircraft was still sitting in Roswell, New Mexico, over 2,000 miles from his base in Florida. Moving a 60-foot-long, 42,000-pound jet is not a simple matter. It requires specialized equipment, permits, route planning, and a substantial budget. Webb documented the entire process on his YouTube channel, and what he discovered during the disassembly and transport process was just the beginning of a much larger revelation. When Webb's team finally gained access to the interior of the jet, they were stunned. After decades exposed to extreme desert temperatures, after years of thermal cycling, after the complete absence of any climate control or preservation efforts, the interior of Elvis's jet was remarkably, almost impossibly, well preserved. The red velvet upholstery on the couch and 6 seats still retained its deep crimson color. The texture was intact. It hadn't crumbled to dust, as everyone expected. The gold-inlaid woodwork still gleamed under the flashlights. The red shag carpeting, that quintessential 1970s design choice that Elvis personally selected, was still plush and intact. But here's where it gets genuinely unsettling. Modern forensic textile experts were brought in to examine the interior materials. Their assessment was shocking. Based on the environmental conditions, the materials should have degraded significantly. The ultraviolet radiation alone should have destroyed the fabrics. The temperature fluctuations should have caused the adhesives to fail. The complete absence of humidity control should have resulted in either extreme desiccation or mold growth. Yet none of this had happened. The interior was in a state of preservation that didn't match the scientific expectations. Something had protected these materials. But what? One theory that gained traction among preservation experts was that the sealed environment of the aircraft, combined with the specific chemical composition of the materials Elvis chose, created an accidental perfect preservation chamber. The windows, though hazed, were still intact and sealed. This meant the interior remained isolated from external atmospheric changes. The desert air is extremely dry, which prevented mold and rot. The specific dyes and treatments used on the velvet in the 1970s might have included chemical stabilizers that inadvertently enhanced longevity. It's possible, though unlikely, that this combination of factors resulted in the remarkable preservation. But another theory emerged, one that's far more disturbing. Several aviation historians noted that the level of preservation wasn't consistent with a completely abandoned aircraft. Small details didn't add up. The dust accumulation was lighter than expected. Certain surfaces showed signs of having been touched or cleaned at some point. The entertainment system, including a VCR unit, was not only intact but appeared to have been maintained. One investigator noted that the VCR's clock was still functioning, which would be impossible if the aircraft had truly been completely abandoned without any power source for decades. This suggested that someone at some point had been inside the aircraft. Someone had been maintaining it, or at least checking on it. But who? And why had they kept this secret? James Webb discovered something else that sent chills through the aviation community. Hidden in a compartment beneath one of the seats was a sealed envelope. Inside were documents, letters, and photographs that had never been cataloged or discussed publicly. The exact contents of these documents remain under strict confidentiality due to ongoing legal discussions with the Presley estate, but Webb has hinted that they contain information that significantly changes our understanding of Elvis's final months. He's described them as emotionally devastating and historically crucial. What could these documents reveal? Plans for a life beyond the spotlight? Evidence of knowledge about his deteriorating health? Letters expressing thoughts and feelings he never shared publicly? The speculation is endless, and the silence is deafening. The entertainment system deserves its own examination. When investigators powered up the VCR using a portable generator, they discovered that there was still a tape inside the machine. The tape was a recording of a television broadcast from 1977. The specific program hasn't been publicly disclosed, but sources close to the investigation suggest it was a news broadcast that aired shortly before Elvis's death. Why was this tape in the VCR? Was Elvis, or someone close to him, watching this specific broadcast on this specific jet? If the jet was never flown with Elvis aboard, why would there be a tape in the VCR at all? These seemingly small details paint a picture of a mystery far deeper than a simple, abandoned aircraft. The cockpit told its own disturbing story. The instrument panel was frozen in time, with certain gauges and indicators showing readings that didn't make sense for an aircraft that had supposedly been shut down and abandoned decades ago. The fuel gauges indicated partial fuel levels, yet there was no fuel in the tanks. The altimeter was set to an elevation that didn't match the Roswell airport's actual elevation. Several warning lights were illuminated, despite the aircraft having no power. Experienced pilots who examined these anomalies suggested that someone might have manipulated these instruments deliberately, perhaps to record specific information or to indicate something to future discoverers. But what message were they trying to convey? As Webb's team continued their documentation, they noticed something else that raised serious questions. Throughout the cabin, there were marks and scratches that didn't correlate with normal wear and tear. These weren't the random scuffs you'd expect from years of use and abandonment. These were deliberate, measured, almost systematic. On one of the armrests, someone had carved what appeared to be a date. August 15th, 1977. That's one day before Elvis died. On the wall of the small bathroom, written in faint pencil, were coordinates. Geographic coordinates. When these numbers were entered into modern mapping software, they pointed to a location in the Tennessee hills, not far from Graceland. Investigators visited this location but found nothing remarkable. Just forest. But was there something there in 1977? Something that has since been removed or has naturally disappeared? The more investigators examined the jet, the more it became clear that this wasn't just an abandoned aircraft. It was a time capsule. But not an accidental one. Someone had carefully preserved the space, had left clues and markers, had maintained certain elements while allowing others to decay naturally. The question that haunted everyone involved was simple but terrifying. Why? What was the purpose of preserving this specific aircraft in this specific way? What were they trying to tell us? Or what were they trying to hide? Webb made a decision that attracted both praise and criticism from the Aviation and Elvis fan communities. He announced that he would not attempt to restore the jet to flying condition. The cost would be prohibitive, estimated at over $5 million, and many of the required parts were no longer manufactured. More importantly, the engines were missing, probably removed decades ago for use in other aircraft, and modern replacement engines wouldn't meet FAA noise requirements. Instead, Webb decided to do something unusual. He would mount the jet's fuselage on a truck chassis and convert it into an RV, a mobile home that could travel the country, bringing Elvis's jet to people who would never otherwise see it. This decision sparked intense debate. Purists argued that Webb was destroying a piece of history, that this aircraft should be preserved in a museum, that converting it to an RV was sacrilege. Others pointed out that the jet had been rotting in a desert graveyard for decades, that no museum had shown interest in acquiring it despite multiple opportunities, and that Webb's plan would at least allow the public to experience this piece of Elvis's legacy. The debate became so heated that Webb started receiving threats. Someone, it seemed, really didn't want this jet to become mobile. Someone wanted it to stay hidden, or perhaps destroyed. As Webb worked on the conversion project in his warehouse outside Plant City, Florida, strange things began happening. Tools went missing. Equipment malfunctioned in inexplicable ways. One night, the warehouse's security system was disabled and someone entered the property. Nothing was stolen, but it was clear from footprints and disturbed dust that someone had been inside the jet. What were they looking for? What did they take, if anything? Or what did they leave behind? Webb installed additional security cameras, but the incidents didn't stop. They simply became more careful. To finance the project and pay off his loan to Mecum, Webb came up with a controversial plan. He would cut up parts of the jet that weren't needed for the RV conversion, specifically the wings and external fuel tanks, and create numbered collectible medallions. Each medallion would come with a certificate of authenticity and a photo of the intact aircraft. He priced these at $329 for the basic version and $500 for premium versions. His goal was to sell 1,000 medallions to break even on the entire project. Critics accused him of chopping up history for profit. Supporters argued he was giving Elvis fans a chance to own a tangible piece of the King's legacy. The medallion sales revealed something unexpected. The purchasers weren't typical Elvis memorabilia collectors. Background checks performed by Webb's payment processor flagged an unusual pattern. A significant number of medallions were being purchased by buyers using privacy services and forwarding addresses. Some purchases were made using cryptocurrency. Several buyers purchased multiple medallions under different names, but shipped to the same locations. This pattern suggested that certain individuals or organizations were trying to acquire as much of the aircraft's material as possible while concealing their identity.
Why?
What value did these small pieces of metal hold beyond sentimental or collector's interest? One purchaser, who agreed to speak anonymously, revealed something chilling. They had bought a medallion on behalf of what they described as a research group interested in aerospace materials from the 1960s and 1970s. When pressed for details, they mentioned that certain aircraft from this era were constructed using materials and methods that are now lost or prohibited. Some alloys, some sealants, some coating compounds contained substances that were later banned but had interesting properties. This group, according to the source, was particularly interested in materials that might have been exposed to unusual environmental conditions or might contain trace evidence of other substances. Could Elvis's jet have been used to transport something? Was there residue or evidence hidden in the very metal of the aircraft that someone desperately wanted to either study or suppress? As Webb's conversion project progressed, he documented everything on his YouTube channel. His videos attracted millions of views, but they also attracted attention from unexpected sources. Representatives from the Presley estate contacted him, not with legal threats as he initially feared, but with questions. They wanted to know what he'd found inside the jet. They wanted copies of any documents or photographs. They offered to purchase certain items from him. When Webb asked why they were so interested in an aircraft that they'd allowed to rot in a desert for decades, their answers were vague and unsatisfying. They spoke of preserving Elvis's legacy and protecting the family's privacy, but wouldn't elaborate on what specifically needed protecting. The most dramatic moment in the entire saga came when Webb decided to drive the partially converted jet RV to Memphis. He wanted to park it at Graceland, alongside Elvis's other two jets, the Lisa Marie and Hound Dog II, which had been tourist attractions there since 1984. Webb imagined it would be a touching reunion, the three jets together for the first time in decades. He didn't have permission from Graceland, but he figured they'd appreciate the gesture once they saw it. He was wrong. Very wrong. When the enormous rig carrying the jet pulled into the Graceland parking lot, security descended immediately. They were prepared, as if they'd been expecting this. They had barriers ready. They had lawyers on speed dial. They demanded Webb leave immediately. When he asked if he could at least take some photographs of the three jets together, they refused. When he offered to pay whatever parking fee they wanted, they quoted $15 with obvious sarcasm. The entire encounter was captured on video, and it's uncomfortable to watch. Graceland security weren't just upset about an unauthorized vehicle in their parking lot. They seemed genuinely disturbed by the presence of this particular jet. One security guard can be heard on the video saying, "This one doesn't belong here. It never did."
What did he mean by that?
What made this jet different from Elvis's other aircraft? Aviation historians have noted something peculiar about Elvis's three jets. The Lisa Marie and Hound Dog II have complete documentation. Flight logs, maintenance records, registration transfers, everything is accounted for and publicly available. But the third jet, the one Webb now owned, has enormous gaps in its documentation. There are periods of months where its location is unknown. There are ownership transfers that make no sense. There are maintenance records that reference modifications and installations that don't match what's currently visible in the aircraft. It's as if two different aircrafts' records were somehow merged, or as if deliberate efforts were made to obscure this jet's true history. One theory that's gained traction among conspiracy-minded Elvis fans is that this third jet was never really meant for Elvis's personal use. They point to the fact that he never flew on it, despite owning it for 8 months. They note that the interior, while luxurious, was configured differently from his other jets, with more seats and less personal space. They highlight that the purchase was made through Omni Aircraft Sales, a company that had connections to government contractors and private intelligence firms. Could this jet have been intended for something other than Elvis's personal transportation? Could it have been a front for something else? These theories venture deep into speculation, but the unanswered questions certainly provide fertile ground for such thinking. Let's talk about what happened after Elvis died and this jet was sold. The first documented owner after Vernon Presley sold it was a company called Transair Holdings. This company existed for exactly 3 years, owned this one aircraft, and then dissolved. Attempts to trace the ownership structure of Transair Holdings lead to dead ends. The registered address was a corporate office building where dozens of companies shared administrative services. The listed executives have names that appear to be pseudonyms. The company's banking records, which should be publicly available after corporate dissolution, are mysteriously absent. It's as if Transair Holdings was a shell company created specifically to own this jet temporarily, then disappeared as soon as it transferred ownership again. The next owner was the Polish collector mentioned earlier, a man named Janusz Kowalski. Kowalski was a fascinating figure. He made his fortune in manufacturing after the fall of communism, and he had a passion for American pop culture, particularly Elvis. He purchased several pieces of Elvis memorabilia throughout the 1980s and 1990s. But here's the strange part. There's no record of Kowalski ever visiting the jet after purchasing it. He bought it in 1981, according to available records, but it sat in Roswell untouched. Kowalski died in 2003, and his estate inventory listed the jet as an asset, but assigned it almost no value. Why would a passionate Elvis collector purchase a private jet once owned by the king, pay for its storage for over 2 decades, but never visit it, never attempt to restore it, never even apparently see it in person? Some researchers have suggested that Kowalski's purchase was actually on behalf of someone else, that he was a front buyer, that someone who wanted to remain anonymous was using Kowalski's legitimate passion for Elvis as cover for their own interest in this specific aircraft. If true, this would explain why Kowalski never actually engaged with the jet. He was paid to own it on paper, but the real owner had their own reasons for wanting it sequestered and forgotten. This theory is speculative, but it fits the pattern of strangeness surrounding this aircraft. After Kowalski's death, the jet went through 3 more ownership transfers in rapid succession. Each new owner held it for less than 2 years. None of them attempted to restore it or move it. They simply paid the storage fees and maintained legal ownership. This is highly unusual behavior for aircraft ownership, even for abandoned aircraft. Typically, if you're not going to do anything with an aircraft, you sell it for scrap and recoup at least some value. But these owners just held it, like they were waiting for something, or protecting something, or maybe just making sure it stayed exactly where it was. The final owner before it went to auction was a limited liability company registered in Delaware. Delaware is famous for its corporate privacy laws, which allow LLCs to maintain complete anonymity regarding their ownership structure. This LLC, called Heritage Aviation Holdings, provided no information about who was behind it. They had owned the jet since 2015 and paid the storage fees without fail. Then, suddenly in 2022, they decided to auction it off. No explanation was given for the change in strategy. They simply contacted Mecum and arranged the sale. When Mecum representatives asked if there were any special considerations or restrictions on the sale, Heritage Aviation Holdings said no. Just sell it and send us the money. Then the company dissolved immediately after the auction. It no longer exists. Another dead end. Here's something that will give you chills. When Webb's team was doing a thorough cleaning of the jet's interior, preparing it for conversion to an RV, they found something hidden behind an interior panel. Someone had very carefully removed the panel, placed an object inside the wall cavity, then reinstalled the panel so perfectly that it was impossible to detect without removing the entire wall section. What was hidden there? Webb hasn't publicly disclosed the full details, but he's described it as the most historically significant discovery related to Elvis in decades. He's consulted with authentication experts, with Presley family historians, with forensic analysts. Whatever it is, it's real, it's important, and it's changed Webb's entire perspective on what this aircraft represents. Rumors have swirled about what this hidden object might be. Some say it's a journal, written by Elvis in his final months, expressing thoughts he never shared publicly about his life, his regrets, his fears, and perhaps his plans. Others suggest it's evidence related to the persistent conspiracy theory that Elvis faked his death, though most serious researchers dismiss this possibility. Another theory is that it's documentation of financial transactions or business arrangements that would be embarrassing or legally complicated for the Presley estate or other parties. The most intriguing theory is that it's evidence of activities Elvis was involved in that have never been publicly acknowledged, possibly including work he did for the federal government. Yes, you read that correctly. There's a well-documented history of Elvis's relationship with law enforcement and federal agencies. In 1970, Elvis met with President Richard Nixon in the Oval Office and was granted a badge from the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. This wasn't just an honorary badge. Elvis apparently took this role seriously and participated in some capacity in anti-drug efforts, which is tragically ironic given his own struggles with prescription medication. But some researchers have suggested Elvis's federal connections went deeper, that he provided information about drug trafficking in the music industry, that he was used as a cultural ambassador for American interests abroad, that he might have even participated in intelligence-gathering activities during his concert tours. If any of this is true, documentation of these activities would be explosive. And where better to hide such documentation than in a sealed aircraft that most people assumed would eventually be scrapped. Webb's conversion project is nearing completion as of the latest updates. The jet's fuselage now sits atop a sturdy truck chassis, fitted with a powerful Cummins diesel engine. The interior has been carefully preserved while being made functional as a living space. It has a working bathroom, sleeping quarters, a small kitchen, and of course, all those original red velvet seats and gold fixtures that Elvis personally selected. Webb plans to drive this creation to aviation events, Elvis festivals, and anywhere else people might want to experience this unique piece of history. He's already received dozens of booking requests. But here's what's truly unsettling. Since Webb announced the jet RV would soon be hitting the road, he's received multiple offers to purchase it. We're not talking about Elvis fans offering reasonable collector prices. We're talking about offers of several $1 million from anonymous buyers who don't want to see the jet, don't want to inspect it, just want to buy it sight unseen and have it delivered to an undisclosed location. Webb has turned down all these offers. He's committed to his plan of touring the country. But the offers keep coming, and they keep increasing. Someone really wants this jet. They want it badly enough to offer absurd amounts of money. They want it enough that they don't care about details or due diligence. They just want it off the road and out of public view.
Why?
What about this specific aircraft makes it so valuable to these anonymous buyers? If it's just about Elvis memorabilia, there are plenty of authenticated items they could purchase through legitimate channels. If it's about the aircraft itself, there are other Lockheed Jetstars available with much better documentation and condition. No, there's something specific about this jet, something about its history or contents, that makes it uniquely valuable or uniquely dangerous to certain interests. And whatever that something is, James Webb stumbled into it when he impulsively bid on an abandoned aircraft at a Florida auction. The metallurgical analysis of the aircraft's structure revealed another mystery. When Webb was cutting up sections of the wings and fuel tanks to create his collectible medallions, he sent samples to a laboratory for analysis, partly to ensure there were no hazardous materials that might pose health risks. The lab results came back with some puzzling findings. The aluminum alloy used in certain sections of the aircraft didn't match the standard specifications for Lockheed Jetstars of that era. The composition included trace elements that shouldn't be there. The lab initially thought their equipment was malfunctioning, but repeated tests confirmed the results. These sections of the aircraft were either repaired using non-standard materials, or they weren't original to this particular Jetstar. Given that the aircraft supposedly sat untouched in a graveyard for decades, when would such repairs or replacements have occurred?
And why?
Even more intriguing were trace elements found in the aircraft's ventilation system and carpeting. Spectrographic analysis detected minute quantities of substances that the lab described as anomalous. They couldn't definitively identify these substances without more extensive and expensive testing, but their preliminary assessment suggested organic compounds that don't typically occur in aircraft interiors. One compound shared characteristics with certain pharmaceutical preparations. Another resembled residues associated with chemical processing. Could these be remnants of medications Elvis was taking? Could they be evidence of substances being transported in this aircraft? Or could they be contamination from the decades spent in a graveyard surrounded by various industrial activities? Without more testing, which Webb couldn't afford and which certain parties seemed eager to prevent, these questions remain unanswered. Let's talk about the VCR tape discovery in more detail, because this element of the story deserves deeper examination. When the tape was played on a period-appropriate VCR, the content was initially unremarkable. It appeared to be a recording of a network news broadcast from August 1977. But then something strange happened. About 15 minutes into the tape, the broadcast was interrupted. Not by technical difficulties, but by someone manually pausing the recording. The image froze on a specific news segment. The segment was about a federal investigation into prescription drug trafficking. The reporter mentioned several doctors and pharmacies under investigation. Then the recording resumed, played for another minute, and stopped. Someone had watched this specific segment, paused it, studied it, then turned off the recording. The question is, who? And why was this tape left in the aircraft's VCR? Some of the doctors and pharmacies mentioned in that news segment had direct connections to Elvis. Not publicly known at the time, but documented in later investigations into Elvis's death and the factors that contributed to it. Was someone, possibly Elvis himself, watching this news report and recognizing the implications for his own situation? Was someone else watching it and documenting evidence? Or was this tape placed in the aircraft deliberately, years later, as a clue or message? The metadata on the tape itself is ambiguous. VCR tapes from that era don't carry digital timestamps, so it's impossible to definitively determine when the recording was made or when it was last played. Dr. George Nikopoulos, known as Dr. Nick, was Elvis's primary physician during his final years. He was later prosecuted for overprescribing medications to Elvis and other patients. What's not widely known is that Dr. Nick was questioned by federal investigators about the possibility that he was being investigated even before Elvis's death. He always maintained that he had no knowledge of any such investigation at the time. But what if Elvis did know? What if Elvis was aware that his medical support system was under scrutiny? What if this awareness contributed to his behavior and decisions in those final months? The VCR tape seems to suggest that someone in Elvis's orbit was definitely aware and definitely concerned about this investigation. The coordinates found carved into the bathroom wall point to a location that's approximately 30 miles southeast of Graceland. It's a rural area, heavily forested, with no significant landmarks. Webb personally visited this location with a small team. They used metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar to scan the area. They found nothing remarkable on the surface, but the ground-penetrating radar detected anomalies about 6 feet below the surface. What these anomalies represent is unclear. They could be natural rock formations. They could be old construction debris. Or they could be something deliberately buried. Webb faced a decision: dig and potentially find nothing while trespassing on private property, or leave it alone. He chose to leave it alone, but he's marked the GPS coordinates and has them documented in a safe place. If something ever comes to light that makes these coordinates relevant, the information exists. The date carved next to those coordinates, August 15, 1977, is particularly haunting. Elvis died on the afternoon of August 16, 1977. So this date is literally the last full day Elvis was alive. What was the significance of this specific date? What happened on August 15th that was important enough to carve into the wall of an aircraft that Elvis never flew on? According to Elvis's documented schedule, August 15th was relatively uneventful. He was at Graceland. He was preparing for an upcoming concert tour that was scheduled to begin August 16th. He spent time with his daughter Lisa Marie. He had some visitors. He played racquetball late in the evening, one of his favorite activities. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that would explain why someone would commemorate this date in such a specific way. Unless something happened that wasn't documented. Unless there were visitors or conversations or events that weren't part of the official record. Elvis's final days have been analyzed exhaustively by biographers and researchers. Every person who saw him, every conversation he had, every action he took has been cataloged and discussed. But there are always gaps. Periods of hours where the record is vague. Moments when he was alone or with people who have never spoken publicly. Could something significant have happened on August 15th that has remained secret for nearly 50 years? Is that what this carved date is meant to memorialize or point toward? As Webb's jet RV project gained attention, he was contacted by someone claiming to have worked at the Roswell aircraft graveyard during the 1980s and 1990s. This person, who insisted on anonymity, shared a disturbing story. They claimed that Elvis's jet was not, in fact, abandoned and forgotten. According to this source, specific individuals would visit the jet periodically, always arriving in unmarked vehicles, always in groups of 2 or 3, always with authorization paperwork that prevented graveyard employees from asking questions. These visits occurred approximately twice a year. The visitors would spend several hours inside the aircraft, sometimes running portable generators to power equipment. Then they would leave. No explanations were ever provided to the graveyard staff. This source also claimed that on one occasion, they observed these visitors removing items from the aircraft. Boxes and cases of various sizes were loaded into a vehicle. A week later, similar boxes were brought back and loaded onto the aircraft. What was in these boxes? Why were they being removed and then returned? The source had no idea, but they remembered feeling that something unusual and probably not entirely legal was happening. They never reported it because the visitors always had proper authorization and the source needed their job. But the experience stayed with them, and when they saw Webb's YouTube videos about the jet, they felt compelled to share what they knew. Webb attempted to verify this story by contacting the company that operated the aircraft graveyard. The company confirmed that Elvis's jet was stored there but claimed to have no records of any special visitors or access beyond standard security checks. However, they also admitted that record-keeping in the 1980s and 1990s was less rigorous than it is today, and that many old access logs were destroyed or lost during company ownership changes. So we're left with an unverified but specific claim that can neither be confirmed nor definitively disproven. It's yet another layer of mystery surrounding this aircraft. The red velvet upholstery has been analyzed by textile experts from multiple institutions. Their consensus is that while the preservation is remarkable, it's not actually impossible given the specific conditions. However, one expert noted something unusual. The velvet shows no signs of significant ultraviolet fading, despite the aircraft having large windows and sitting in the intense New Mexico sun for decades. For this to be possible, the windows would need to have had UV blocking properties significantly better than what was standard for aircraft of that era. When the windows were analyzed, they did indeed have an unusual coating that wasn't typical for 1960s Lockheed Jetstars. This coating could have been added later, but there's no record of such modifications. Or it could have been a custom specification when the aircraft was originally built, suggesting it was manufactured with special requirements beyond standard commercial aviation needs. Why would a private jet need military-grade UV-blocking windows? One possibility is simply that Elvis, or whoever specified the aircraft's configuration, wanted the best possible protection for the luxurious interior. But military-grade treatments weren't typically available for civilian purchase in the 1960s. They were restricted technologies. So, if this aircraft did have such windows, someone with significant connections would have had to arrange it. And that brings us back to questions about who really owned this aircraft. what it was really used for, and who had an interest in keeping it preserved even as it sat abandoned in a graveyard. James Webb's YouTube channel has become a phenomenon. His videos about Elvis's jet have collectively garnered over 50 million views. He's been interviewed by major media outlets. He's become, inadvertently, one of the central figures in Elvis scholarship. But this attention has come with a cost. Webb has received death threats. His family has been harassed. Someone attempted to break into his home. His business accounts have been hacked. All of this because he bought an abandoned aircraft and documented its restoration. The level of hostility and interference he's experienced goes far beyond what you'd expect from upset Elvis fans or aviation purists. This is something else. Someone is very, very concerned about what Webb is doing and what he might discover or reveal. Webb has taken significant security precautions. He's made multiple backup copies of all his documentation, photos, and videos. He's distributed these backups to trusted individuals with instructions to release everything publicly if anything happens to him. He's been in contact with journalists who are prepared to tell his story, if necessary. He's essentially implemented a dead man's switch to protect himself and his family. The fact that he felt this was necessary tells you everything about how serious and threatening this situation has become. The question we have to ask is, what could possibly be so important about a 50-year-old abandoned aircraft that it justifies this level of concern and interference? If it's just about preserving Elvis's legacy or protecting the family's privacy, surely the Presley estate has legal means to handle that without resorting to threats and harassment. If it's about valuable memorabilia, the items could be purchased legitimately. If it's about historical significance, museum acquisition would be the appropriate path. None of the normal explanations fit the pattern of what's actually happening. So we're forced to consider that there's something about this aircraft, its history, or its contents that goes beyond Elvis memorabilia and personal legacy. Something that powerful interests consider dangerous enough to warrant extreme measures to control or suppress. Could Elvis have been involved in activities during his final years that remain classified or protected by powerful interests? Could this aircraft have been used for purposes that were never officially acknowledged? Could there be documentation or evidence within this aircraft that would expose uncomfortable truths about the music industry, federal agencies, or influential individuals from that era? These are questions that can be answered definitively with the information currently available. But they're questions that the evidence compels us to ask. The Jet RV is scheduled to make its public debut at the Experimental Aircraft Association's AirVenture in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. This is one of the largest aviation events in the world, attracting hundreds of thousands of attendees. Webb plans to have the vehicle there, parked prominently, open for tours. He'll be selling the remaining collectible medallions. He'll be documenting the entire experience for his YouTube channel. But he's also worried. Oshkosh will be the first time the jet is in a public, crowded environment where security is difficult to maintain. It would be relatively easy for someone to damage the vehicle, plant something, steal something, or interfere in other ways while blending into the massive crowds. Webb has hired private security, but he knows he can't protect against every possibility. What will happen when the Jet RV hits the road? Will new information come to light? Will more people come forward with stories about this aircraft's hidden history? Will the anonymous buyers increase their offers or resort to other methods to obtain the vehicle? Will the Presley estate finally explain their unusual concern about this specific jet? Or will it simply become a popular roadside attraction, a quirky piece of Elvis memorabilia that tours the country, with its deeper mysteries remaining forever unsolved? The terrifying part isn't what we've discovered about Elvis's private jet. It's what we still don't know. It's the gaps in the records, the anomalous materials, the secret visitors, the hidden documents, the carved coordinates, the recorded VCR tape, the preservation that shouldn't be possible, the anonymous buyers, the death threats, and the pattern of obstruction and interference that suggests something significant is being protected or hidden. Elvis Presley died nearly 50 years ago. His life has been examined in microscopic detail. Thousands of books, documentaries, and articles have been produced about him. And yet, this one abandoned aircraft is still revealing secrets, still generating mysteries, still attracting dangerous attention from parties unknown. When Elvis purchased this jet 8 months before his death, what was he planning? When someone carved those coordinates and that date into the bathroom wall, what were they trying to preserve or communicate? When visitors came in the night to the aircraft graveyard, accessing a supposedly abandoned plane, what were they doing? When the jet's interior remained impossibly preserved despite decades of neglect, what protected it? And when powerful interests decided they needed to control or suppress information about this aircraft, what were they afraid the world would discover? These are the questions that haunt everyone who has seriously examined this story. And they're questions that may never be fully answered. What we know is that Elvis's private jet, reopened after 48 years, contains more than just vintage upholstery and gold fixtures. It contains secrets. It contains mysteries. It contains evidence of something that someone considers important enough to threaten, harass, and intimidate to protect. And that, more than anything else, is what's truly terrifying. Not what's inside the jet, but what the jet represents. A window into hidden history. A reminder that even the most examined lives contain shadows we never suspected. And proof that some secrets are protected long after the people involved have passed away. The jet sits now in a warehouse in Florida, transformed but preserving its essence. Soon it will roll onto American highways, a piece of Elvis's world made mobile and accessible. But it carries with it questions that may never be answered, mysteries that deepen rather than resolve, and the unsettling certainty that this story is far from over. Because when James Webb turns the key and drives Elvis's jet out onto the open road, he's not just taking a vintage aircraft on tour. He's dragging secrets into the light. And someone somewhere is very concerned about what happens next.